Before 1948, the military was segregated. African American men had been perceived as though they had a smaller skill set than Caucasian men. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed and approved Executive Order 9981 desegregating the U.S. military. This political transformation changed the stance of the U.S. Armed Forces legally and socially and would eternally shift the manner in which people view the enlisted men and women of America. In the military, African Americans had been seen and treated differently than Caucasian men since the American Revolution. They were kept in boot camps for months longer than Caucasian men and were not able to achieve higher rankings. This problem had not been addressed until President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 desegregating the U.S. military. From there, African Americans no longer fought in separate infantries and were given the same treatment as Caucasians. This order set up a committee that would overlook the military and survey their treatment to colored people.
To do all that I can for the welfare of this nation and for the peace of the world.
World War I was the first war that the segregation of African Americans in the military became prevalent. Before the outbreak of the war, there were 20,000 African Americans in the U.S. military out of the 750,000 total men serving our country. When the war began, there was a mandatory enlistment policy put in place. Over 367,000 African Americans were brought into the armed forces. This changed the balance of the race in the military, but it did not change how African Americans were treated. The military was still segregated, with African Americans being treated at a lower level than ever before. African Americans were put in military camps that were much worse than Caucasian camps, and when African Americans were on leave or at home from the military, they were beaten and abused, sometimes even shot and killed. It's sad to think that these men served to risk their lives for the freedom of America and lasted through war, only to be killed when they came home. There was an African American on mess duty on a ship during the Pearl Harbor attack. When the attack broke out, with no proper training or knowledge of combat, the soldier grabbed one of the mounted guns and shot down a Japanese bomber. Though he did receive the Purple Cross for bravery, he remained on mess duty. This is a perfect example of African Americans proving they're capable, but nothing changed after this event.
By World War II, there were over 1 million African Americans in the military. This made up 6% of the service. African Americans provided most of the hard work and labor needed for the war. They rode on transport trucks and helped rebuild Europe. They were not being pushed to their full potential, though. At the tail end of the war, African American men in labor units would jump into combat as a replacement for Caucasian men. This change does end its success. During the course of World War II, the 555th Parachute Infantry was established, known as the Triple Nickels. This unit was all African American soldiers and was the first of its kind. They helped show that African Americans are capable and do not need to be restricted to manual labor. The Triple Nickels started off as a very hated group of men, but over time were proven to be a very brave group of men. They served as an example to show the potential in African American soldiers. When World War II ended, some of the policies restricting African Americans into the military had been put back in place, limiting the amount of colored men allowed in the military. After World War II, a peacetime draft had begun. Civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph stepped up and encouraged African Americans to boycott the draft until the military was desegregated. Philip Randolph played a seemingly small role in the desegregation, but in the end, his involvement is what caused the executive order desegregating the military to be put in place. A community is democratic only when the humblest and weakest person can enjoy the highest civil, economic, and social rights. That, the biggest and most powerful, possess. A. Philip Randolph.
On July 26, 1948, in response to Philip Randolph's protests, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. military. By 1950, the laws limiting the amount of African Americans in the military had been lifted, and by the end of the Korean War, the U.S. Armed Forces were fully integrated. Executive Order 9981 created a committee that was made up of 7 people who will serve the military and keep race and equality within it. This committee was given all the power needed to complete this job, and to do it well, The order gave the committee power over the military in the sense that they could access most documents within it, and the military and government were told they had to cooperate with the committee. The Vietnam War was the first war that the U.S. was involved in with fully integrated forces. During the war, African Americans had the highest population to military ratio, with many of them enlisted in the forces. Although the military was integrated, many still believed that African Americans were still not treated perfectly, and these beliefs may still be present today. World War I and II were some of the most influential times in the desegregation of the military. After World War II, President Harry S. Truman pushed out Executive Order 9981. This created a committee to enforce the desegregation of the military. The Vietnam and Korean Wars both showed the power of an integrated military and showed that African Americans are as efficient as Caucasian men when it comes to the military.
We believe that all men have a right to equal justice under law and equal opportunity to share in the common good. We believe that all men have the right to freedom of thought and expression. We believe that all men are created equal because they are created in the image of God.